Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we peel back the royal curtains and step into the scandal-soaked life of one of history's most infamously indulgent monarchs, Ferdinand VII of Spain. But be warned, this story spirals quickly from the lavish to the lewd, from the political to the perversely personal. If you're expecting tasteful tales of diplomatic dinners and royal balls, well, they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little show travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ferdinand is born in 1784, a bouncing Bourbon baby already tangled in dynastic drama. His father, King Carlos IV, is more interested in hunting than ruling, and his mother, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, is the type of overbearing royal matriarch who collects lovers like porcelain figurines. It's whispered, loudly and often, that her favourite Manuel de Godoy isn't just the Prime Minister but also her paramour. And young Ferdinand? He watches all of it with quiet, calculating eyes. Even as a child, Ferdinand seems to grasp something most adults don't. Power isn't inherited, it's taken. By the time he's 12, he's mastered the princely trifecta: flattery, false humility, and faked innocence. Tutors praise his piety and good manners, but court insiders know better. They've seen the way he listens behind doors and hides notes in his shoes. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's early personality was warped by palace dysfunction, or if he was simply born with a flair for deceit. Either way, he quickly learns that secrets are currency. He befriends chambermaids, tips the gardeners, and sweet-talks the kitchen boys, not out of kindness, but to gather information. The court is a chessboard, and Ferdinand is quietly moving pawns. By the time he's a teenager, he already has a shadow court, a secret circle of supporters fed up with his father's passive rule and Godoy's swaggering arrogance. They call themselves Fernandistas, and though they sip tea in silk gloves, they're plotting a coup. Ferdinand begins to see his father less as a parent and more as an obstacle. The official heir in name, yes, but powerless in reality. He wants more than titles. He wants to rule, to dominate, to control everything down to the shape of the buttons on a servant's coat. And he's not patient. By 1707, Europe is on fire with revolution, and Napoleon is the matchstick. Spain, supposedly neutral, is actually crumbling from within. Godoy's treaties with France are as confusing as they are unpopular, and Ferdinand sees his moment. He begins secret correspondence with Napoleon himself. Yes, that Napoleon. In a move so reckless and treacherous it could only come from a teenage prince with far too much confidence. He writes letters dripping with flattery, offering allegiance and begging for counsel. Napoleon, never one to pass up a dynastic soap opera, plays along. He sees Ferdinand as a useful idiot, a royal wrecking ball to smash Spain's monarchy from the inside. And Ferdinand, thinking himself cunning, is flattered by the emperor's attention. One of the more bizarre details from this period, Ferdinand reportedly kept a bust of Napoleon in his private chambers and spoke to it at night, asking for guidance. Was this political theatre? Desperate loneliness? Or a hint of something darker stirring in his psyche? Scholars disagree, but one thing's certain. This wasn't your average heir to the throne behaviour. By the spring of 1808, Ferdinand finally makes his move. With public unrest rising, he accuses his father and Godoy of corruption and demands the crown. Shockingly, the pressure works. Carlos IV abdicates, worn down by protests, intrigue, and frankly, exhaustion. So, just like that, Ferdinand VII becomes king. At 23, he has what he's always wanted: power. But before he even warms the throne cushion, Napoleon springs his trap. Ferdinand is invited to Bayonne, France, for what's supposed to be a diplomatic meeting. In reality, it's a glorified kidnapping. Napoleon forces him to abdicate in favour of Napoleon's own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Spain loses its king, gains a puppet, and Ferdinand is hauled off to a gilded prison in Valenciennes. And here's where it gets even weirder. Instead of reacting with anger or resistance, Ferdinand adapts to captivity like a pampered house cat. He lounges, eats lavishly, and keeps writing fawning letters to Napoleon. One includes a drawing of a heart pierced by a sword, with "Your faithful Ferdinand" scrawled underneath. Cringe, absolutely. but also a glimpse into how this man views submission, not as failure, but as strategy. He spends 6 years in this strange political limbo. While guerrilla warfare tears Spain apart, Ferdinand becomes an object of myth. To some, he's a martyr king, to others, a spineless sycophant. Both are partially true. In captivity, his quirks begin to harden into obsessions. He demands that servants rotate their uniforms weekly, allegedly so he doesn't get visually bored. He starts cataloguing punishments for imagined betrayals, scribbling ideas into a leather-bound journal, some of which will later resurface in law, and he develops an almost theatrical fondness for Catholic rituals, holding mock processions in his drawing room complete with incense and fake monks. One curious servant later claims Ferdinand used to dress as a penitent monk for fun, complete with chains and a scourge. Whether this was for spiritual reflection or something far more personal is, again, hotly debated. By 1813, Napoleon is losing his grip on Europe, and the Spanish people, bleeding, starving, furious, demand their king back. The Allies push the French out, and Ferdinand returns, carried home on a tide of national relief. But he's changed. The boy king who once wrote love letters to Napoleon is now a hardened cynic, his smile a little too slow, his gaze a little too fixed, and while crowds cheer, he barely acknowledges them. He's thinking about vengeance, about control, about turning Spain into his personal theatre of power and pleasure. Before the sun sets on his first day back, he nullifies the liberal constitution drafted in his absence. He reinstates absolute monarchy. He jails reformers, reboots the Inquisition, and places himself not just at the centre of politics, but of morality, religion, and daily life. He isn't just king anymore, he's Spain. And if Spain has a pulse, it beats to his twisted rhythm. Ferdinand's return to Spain in 1814 is choreographed like a holy resurrection. Towns ring their church bells, streets flood with loyalists weeping at the sight of their king. Priests deliver fiery sermons on divine monarchy, and peasants scatter flower petals in front of his carriage wheels. But beneath the golden confetti and trumpet blasts, Ferdinand's smile never quite reaches his eyes. He's not here for a reunion, he's here for revenge. First on the chopping block, the very idea of a constitutional government. While Ferdinand was locked away in France, liberal thinkers had drafted the Cadiz Constitution of 1812, a bold, progressive document that limited the monarchy and embraced concepts like free speech, suffrage, and separation of powers. In other words, Ferdinand's worst nightmare. Just weeks after setting foot in Madrid, he declares the constitution null and void. In a single speech, he abolishes representative government, imprisons its authors, and returns Spain to absolute rule. The audience, many of them hoping for compromise, falls silent. Ferdinand is unmoved. He doesn't want applause. He wants submission. The first few months of his restored reign are a flurry of decrees. He reinstates censorship, dissolves parliament, and empowers a network of secret police. But perhaps his most chilling revival is the re-establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. Yes, that Inquisition. Long thought a relic of medieval cruelty, Ferdinand brings it roaring back like a greatest hits album of torment. Under the revived Inquisition, citizens are encouraged to report heresy, impiety, or even mild sarcasm. Confessors are overwhelmed with fearful whispers. My neighbour skipped Mass. My cousin reads French novels. One widow is tried for witchcraft after claiming her cat talks to her. Though, to be fair, that cat was reportedly quite chatty. Ferdinand doesn't just allow these purges, he relishes them. He reads trial summaries over breakfast, sipping thick chocolate while debating whether blasphemers should be exiled or flogged. He adds personal notes in the margins like, have the bishop review this one, or make an example of him. And behind the official policy lies something murkier. Ferdinand begins hosting private confessions, not in churches, but in the royal palace. Select priests are summoned to his chambers, where they are instructed to ask visiting nobles not only about sins, but desires. What arouses them, what frightens them, what they've fantasized about. These confessions are written down and archived. For safety, he claims. For leverage, says everyone else. Historians still argue whether this shadow inquisition was part of a larger intelligence network or just a voyeuristic indulgence. Either way, it grows. By 1816, a special wing of the palace is devoted to confession archives. locked cabinets filled with the darkest secrets of Spain's elite. Ferdinand in his dressing gown likes to read them late at night by candlelight. His bedroom becomes a hub of nocturnal activity. Servants come and go at odd hours. Some claim to deliver letters, others food, but few talk about what they actually saw. Those who do whisper of velvet walls, mirrors on ceilings, and a collection of wigs that grows larger each month. The king, it seems, enjoys disguises. He plays roles in his own court, sometimes appearing in full clerical robes, sometimes in the uniform of a palace guard. One foreign ambassador records in his diary that during a midnight meeting, he found Ferdinand seated on a throne of cushions dressed as a nun. Is it theatre? Madness? Power play? All three? The king begins rotating favourites at court, not based on merit but amusement. Those who flatter him creatively rise quickly. One noblewoman reportedly gains influence by inventing daily compliments for his ankles. Another is given a villa for reciting poetry about his earlobes. Critics, of course, disappear. In one particularly cruel instance, a general who objects to the use of torture is assigned to a remote outpost in North Africa. His letters home vanish, his family too. Meanwhile, Ferdinand surrounds himself with pleasure engineers. That's not their official title, but it might as well be. These are artists, actors, musicians, brought in not to entertain the court, but the king alone. One singer is forced to perform the same aria every night for a month, while Ferdinand critiques her posture through a spyglass. A juggler is hired and made to juggle flaming torches while reciting psalms backward. But perhaps nothing illustrates his reign more than the Palace of Obedience, an informal nickname for a refurbished monastery near Madrid. Converted under his direct orders, it becomes a secret retreat for indulgence. Guards are handpicked for loyalty and silence. Guests are invited with coded letters. Inside, reports describe lavish banquets with aphrodisiac-laced courses, rooms with hidden observation slits, and actors hired to recreate scenes from ancient Roman decadence. And yet, Ferdinand plays the devout Catholic. Every morning he attends Mass with solemn dignity. He crosses himself fervently. He funds new cathedrals and demands sermons in his honour. One priest faints mid-sermon from trying too hard to rhyme Ferdinand with command. Still, cracks begin to show. Spain's economy struggles under the weight of war debts, poor harvests, and overzealous taxation. Ferdinand's obsession with gold embellishments drains the treasury. Entire villages are taxed to fund a single royal necklace. Roads fall into disrepair. Trade falters. And abroad, Spain's colonies begin to revolt. Latin America, inspired by revolutionary fervour and fed up with imperial neglect, rises. Venezuela declares independence, then Colombia, then Mexico. Ferdinand reacts with disbelief. How dare his colonies abandon him? He tries sending troops. They defect. He tries dispatching envoys. They're mocked. Finally, he commissions a pamphlet called The King's Love for His Overseas Children. It's reprinted as toilet paper in Caracas. Desperate to reassert control, Ferdinand doubles down on absolutism. He arrests liberal thinkers, bans foreign literature, and installs a state-run printing press. Even the concept of hope is deemed subversive. One poet is exiled for a sonnet that vaguely implies dawn. And while the country simmers, Ferdinand becomes increasingly paranoid. He installs secret passageways between his bedrooms, orders the palace musicians to sleep with one ear open, assigns servants to spy on other servants. The royal cook is changed weekly, after the king develops a theory that spices can be used to control minds. But here's where it turns. By 1820, even the military, once his iron fist, is sick of the absurdity. A liberal uprising forces Ferdinand to accept the very constitution he once burned. For 3 tense years, Spain is ruled by what historians call the liberal triennium. Ferdinand, outwardly compliant, seethes in silence. He pretends to cooperate, signs reform bills with a trembling hand, and hosts polite tea parties with ministers he fantasizes about strangling. Then, like clockwork, he claws his way back. With the help of a French invasion known as the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, Ferdinand crushes the liberal movement. He imprisons his enemies, burns their books, and redeclares himself absolute monarch in 1823. And this time, he's crueler. He creates a council to revise Spain's moral code, meaning he rewrites it himself. Adultery becomes treason. Gossip is criminalised. Disrespect toward the sovereign carries a sentence of hard labour. One widow is imprisoned for naming her parrot Pepe, a nickname of a disliked noble. Ferdinand's worldview is crystallized. Loyalty is everything, dissent is sin, and pleasure is proof of divine favour. Spain no longer just serves the king, it must reflect him. And what it reflects, increasingly, is a distorted portrait of vanity, fear, and secret longing. If Spain's political landscape looks bleak under Ferdinand VII, his personal life is no brighter, though it is significantly stranger. As king, he doesn't just rule. He orchestrates his life like an elaborate masquerade, with every room in his palace a new stage, every interaction a half-rehearsed play. And no one, absolutely no one, is immune from being cast in a role. When Ferdinand returns to power in 1823, having crushed the liberal movement yet again, his palace becomes more insulated than ever. Outsiders see only grandeur, crystal chandeliers, embroidered tapestries, gold-trimmed halls. But behind those glittering facades, something unnerving takes root. For starters, Ferdinand begins sleeping during the day and staying awake through most of the night. Nocturnal by choice, he claims that darkness clears the mind. More likely it just hides things. By dusk, the palace shifts. Servants switch roles. Guards disappear from their posts. Hallways flicker with candlelight and echo with soft, mismatched footsteps. It's during these hours that Ferdinand walks. Not purposefully, like a monarch inspecting his domain, but aimlessly, like a ghost trapped in velvet slippers. He shuffles from chamber to chamber, sometimes in robes, sometimes in costumes. One servant recalls seeing him dressed as a jester, holding a lute he couldn't play. Another says he donned a monk's habit and recited half-remembered prayers in a whispery chant. He prowls the palace like a nocturnal predator, not to harm, but to watch. Through cleverly placed peepholes and mirrored panels, Ferdinand turns the royal palace into a living diorama. Guests are observed while they sleep, while they eat, while they speak to each other in what they think is privacy. Some scholars call this paranoid surveillance. Others describe it as a form of deeply theatrical voyeurism. In one infamous case, a courtier receives a beautiful wardrobe from the king as a gift, each item tailored to perfection. What he doesn't know is that the wardrobe's mirror has been replaced with a one-way panel. Ferdinand watches for weeks as the man undresses, reads letters, and grooms himself, until one night he finds the mirror covered with a handkerchief. The courtier is banished the next morning. This obsession with control leaks into his interpersonal relationships. Ferdinand cannot simply have a court, he must curate it. He rotates staff obsessively. Guards serve no more than 5 days in one hallway. Servants wear colour-coded ribbons indicating their access level. Anyone who becomes too familiar, too comfortable, is dismissed. Familiarity is a threat. Even his advisors are rotated like crops. He prefers sycophants who can entertain him with gossip, mimicry, or peculiar talents. One minister allegedly kept his position by imitating animal sounds on command. Another survived a scandal by designing a chess set featuring royal figures dressed as biblical characters. Ferdinand made him replay the crucifixion using only pawns. But even in this eccentric carnival of governance, one man towers above all others in influence. Father Victoriano, Ferdinand's confessor, spiritual advisor, and, some suspect, his psychological enabler. Tall, pale, and eerily calm, Victoriano is known for his soothing voice and ambiguous morality. He supports every purge, every crackdown, yet always with a pained sigh, as if burdened by divine duty. He introduces Ferdinand to the idea of sin as spectacle, that watching others fall is not a sin if it deepens the soul's understanding of temptation. Under Victoriano's advice, Ferdinand begins organising moral exercises. Courtiers are invited to secret gatherings where they must confess sins, not their own, but each other's. Some accuse friends of gluttony, others whisper rumours of affairs. At the end, Ferdinand decides punishments by lottery. A fine, a public prayer, or occasionally a dramatic but symbolic flogging, performed by actors, but still disturbing. And yes, the rumours about the flogging room are real. Deep in the palace's eastern wing there's a soundproof chamber nicknamed La Galleria del Latigo, the Gallery of the Whip. Visitors are blindfolded upon entering. They never see their audience, only hear soft giggles behind curtains. The participants? Unknown. The purpose? Obscure. But everyone agrees, the king is always watching. Meanwhile, Spain continues to unravel. The loss of colonial territories accelerates. Treasury reserves dwindle, smuggling thrives, entire industries collapse, while Ferdinand throws ornate festivals celebrating his triumph over chaos. During one such event, 1,000 candles are lit in the shape of his face. The smell of melting wax and scorched velvet lingers for days, and yet, among all this, Ferdinand decides he's ready to remarry. His first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, died in 1806 under circumstances still debated. Was it tuberculosis, as officially claimed, or poison, administered by court enemies or even by Ferdinand himself? Historians remain divided. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, died in childbirth in 1818. She was beloved by many, a gentle counterbalance to his darker whims. Ferdinand reportedly wept at her funeral, not for love lost, but because no one will ever mother me like she did. A deeply revealing statement, if a deeply disturbing one. Then comes his third wife, Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony. 16 years old, devout, and emotionally unprepared for royal life, she enters a world where piety is punished and discretion is currency. Ferdinand is in his 40s and reportedly infatuated. But his methods of wooing are unconventional. He stages elaborate pageants for her, including one in which he plays the role of Saint Sebastian, shirtless, tied to a post, painted with fake arrows. She faints. Another time he delivers her a live swan, its neck twisted into a decorative bow. She vomits. On their wedding night, Maria Josefa is so terrified that she locks herself in her chamber and refuses to come out. Ferdinand reportedly spends the night serenading her through the keyhole, with Gregorian chants. Eventually he gains access. Details remain thankfully vague, but the relationship never recovers. She retreats into prayer and melancholy. He retreats into other pursuits. One of these pursuits involves commissioning erotic paintings from court artists, portraits of biblical figures in compromising positions. When questioned, he insists they are moral warnings, not titillation. One scholar suggests Ferdinand was engaged in a form of aesthetic contradiction, using sacred imagery to navigate his own guilt. Others just call it what it is, blasphemous kink. But nothing symbolises Ferdinand's descent quite like his transformation of the royal chapel. What was once a solemn, holy space becomes a carnival of contradiction. Choir boys are made to wear theatrical costumes. Mass is performed with interpretive dance. At one point, the altar is replaced with a mechanical device that raises and lowers the priest like a stage magician. Some nobles complain, others applaud. No one quite knows what's happening. And then comes the donkey. In a surreal moment that even loyalists struggle to explain, Ferdinand enters the chapel one morning leading a donkey dressed in a bishop's mitre. He claims it represents stubborn faith. The symbolism is lost on everyone, but the laughter that echoes through the marble halls like thunder. By 1829, Ferdinand is 45 and visibly deteriorating. His weight balloons, his skin grows blotchy, he wheezes when he laughs, and his teeth, already crooked, begin falling out one by one. His doctors prescribe a rotating cocktail of herbs, leeches and ice baths. Nothing works. He begins to suspect poisoning, though most believe it's the result of poor diet, unchecked stress and decades of self-indulgence. Still, he's not done yet. Spain, for all its fractures, remains loyal, mostly out of fear, and Ferdinand, he remains hungry for loyalty, for control, and for something deeper, something no title can grant. He wants to be adored. Ferdinand VII begins his 5th decade on Earth, as a man swollen with power and plagued by his own obsessions. His face, once described as boyishly aristocratic, is now permanently flushed, his jawline hidden behind layers of sagging flesh. Yet his sense of vanity only sharpens. He commissions ever more flattering portraits, instructing court painters to gently reimagine his physique and complexion. One poor artist is banished after depicting the king with a double chin, true to life, yes, but woefully out of royal favour. But Ferdinand is not just concerned with his image on canvas. He sees himself as the embodiment of Spain's moral authority, despite embodying almost none of it privately. His fascination with confession, control and sin continues to shape his reign. By now, the royal chapel is essentially a stage for theatrical rituals that blur the line between devotion and decadence. On Good Friday, he orders a mock crucifixion to be performed, with himself playing the thief who repents at the last moment. Witnesses describe the scene as both disturbing and oddly moving. A few courtiers weep. Most stare at the floor, trying not to smirk. One bishop later remarks in his diary, "I fear His Majesty confuses penitence with performance." And he does. Everything Ferdinand touches becomes theatre. His council meetings involve elaborate call and response dialogues, where ministers must answer his rhetorical questions with rehearsed praise. "What is justice?" he asks one morning, before anyone has had coffee. "It is the will of the king made law," replies the finance minister, who promptly receives a bonus. Behind closed doors, things are stranger still. Ferdinand has a special interest in punishment. Not the public kind, but private, tailored and often absurd. He maintains a handwritten book of corrections, detailing the unique discipline he believes appropriate for each type of transgression. For a noble caught gambling, he prescribes a month of forced sobriety. For a maid who broke a porcelain figurine, she must write 100 lines of "The king is patient even when I am clumsy." Then there's the case of Don Ramon, a minor noble who criticised one of Ferdinand's decrees in a letter to his cousin. Somehow the letter is intercepted. Ferdinand doesn't punish Ramon directly. Instead, he has the man's favourite parlour chair removed and replaced with one that squeaks loudly whenever he shifts his weight. When questioned, the king simply replies, "Let him sit with shame." It's in this context, of paranoia, performance and punishment, that Ferdinand begins to focus on an even more delicate project, solidifying the legacy of his bloodline. Spain is once again gripped by the question of succession. Ferdinand has no surviving heirs. His health is worsening. The pressure to produce an heir becomes an obsession, and so, in 1829 he marries for the 4th time, his niece, Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily. She's 23, he is 45. The marriage is less a union than a national mandate. Maria Cristina is pragmatic, pious and sharp. She knows what's expected. She also knows that Ferdinand is no ordinary husband. He insists on supervising her medical checkups, reading the notes from her midwives, even interviewing her confessor. He demands nightly reports on her mood, appetite and, most invasively, her fertility. The royal doctors begin a regimen designed to maximise her chances of conception. It includes specific diets, strange teas, and daily foot massages to align the womb, as one court physician absurdly claims. Historians still debate the effectiveness of this method. They do not debate the awkwardness. Ferdinand becomes increasingly erratic. He holds mock baptism ceremonies with dolls, as if practising for the real event. He hosts a fertility ball, where guests are required to wear pink and blue. He has a miniature cradle built entirely of silver, displayed in the main salon like a holy relic. And finally, in 1830 his efforts bear fruit. Maria Cristina is pregnant. The news is announced with a parade, fireworks and special masses across Spain. The nation exhales, the court prepares. Ferdinand smiles wider than he has in years. But then comes the real complication, the Salic law. Under this ancient rule, inherited from the Bourbons, women cannot inherit the throne. Ferdinand has no sons. If the child is a girl, she has no claim. That would mean the crown passes to Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, a man whose conservative zealotry makes Ferdinand look tame. And Ferdinand, ever the theatrical king, does not intend for his legacy to be hijacked. So, in a bold move, he issues the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, abolishing the Salic law and allowing his daughter, if born, to inherit the crown. The country is split. Traditionalists cry foul. Liberals remain cautious. Don Carlos fumes in silence, gathering support in the shadows. 9 months later, Maria Cristina gives birth to a girl, Isabella. Spain rejoices, but only briefly, because the birth of Isabella ignites what will become one of the most bitter succession conflicts in Spanish history, the Carlist Wars. While newborn Isabella coos in her bassinet, half the nation begins whispering Don Carlos's name with reverence. Ferdinand, however, focuses only on the baby. He insists on feeding her himself, despite having no experience and an alarming tendency to doze off mid-task. He commissions paintings of her before she can sit up. He writes lullabies, most of which contain subtle references to absolutism. One, disturbingly, includes the line, "Rule them before they ask you why." As Isabella grows, Ferdinand grows more obsessed. He watches her sleep, dictates her clothing, and prohibits her from interacting with anyone not personally vetted. Even Maria Cristina begins to worry. At one point she requests that the nursery be moved farther from his chamber. He refuses. The court begins to fray. Don Carlos's supporters grow bolder. They hold secret masses, distribute pamphlets, and begin arming rural militias. Ferdinand cracks down with increasing desperation. He reintroduces military patrols in major cities, censors newspapers with surgical precision, and declares that Spain is one will, mine. Meanwhile, his health deteriorates rapidly. He develops gout, a hacking cough, and a bloated belly that no sash can conceal. His doctors try bleeding, poultices, and an alarming amount of eel broth. Nothing helps. He becomes irritable, sluggish, and at times incoherent. Still, he clings to power. He insists on holding audiences, even when he can barely sit upright. He forces ministers to shout because he's gone half deaf. He occasionally falls asleep mid-decree and must be gently prodded by Maria Cristina. But even as his body fails him, Ferdinand never loses his appetite for spectacle. One of his last public appearances is a grand procession to display baby Isabella to the people. Carried in a velvet cradle, surrounded by guards in golden armour, she's paraded through Madrid like a living relic. Ferdinand, wrapped in furs despite the heat, waves from a special glass carriage, wheezing between smiles. And then, just weeks later, he collapses. For days, the palace descends into chaos. Doctors rush in. Priests arrive. Ministers gather, all waiting. Ferdinand slips in and out of consciousness. At one point, he insists on holding a miniature crown, placing it on Isabella's head himself, a gesture both symbolic and profoundly theatrical. On September the 29th, 1833, Ferdinand VII dies at the age of 49. The palace curtains are drawn, bells toll, black ribbons adorn the city, and Spain braces itself. Because while the king is dead, the chaos he created is very much alive. The bells that toll for Ferdinand VII's death ring with more complexity than sorrow. To the Spanish people, his passing is not merely the end of a monarch. It's the opening act of a civil war that has been simmering beneath powdered wigs and ceremonial fanfare for years. As the black drapery is hung across Madrid's narrow balconies, and masses are offered in cathedrals thick with incense, everyone is thinking the same question. Who rules now? Isabella, Ferdinand's daughter and designated heir, is not even 3 years old. Too young to rule, too precious to ignore. Her mother, Maria Cristina, is immediately declared regent, a delicate title for a volatile role. She must now defend her daughter's claim, maintain royal authority, and navigate the minefield of loyalties Ferdinand has left behind, all while raising a toddler in a palace where every hallway hums with whispered conspiracy. And then there's Don Carlos. Ferdinand's brother, exiled in temperament and nearly in title, emerges from the shadows like a bitter ghost. A strict absolutist and devout Catholic, Carlos believes himself the rightful heir by the old Salic law, abolished by Ferdinand in what Carlos sees as a heretical betrayal. He denounces Maria Cristina's regency, calls Isabella's claim illegitimate, and within weeks, his supporters, the Carlists, raise flags in the northern provinces. Thus begins the First Carlist War. It is not merely a war of succession, but of ideology. On one side, conservatives, rural clergy, and monarchists who see Don Carlos as a saviour of tradition. On the other, liberals, urbanites, and constitutionalists clinging to the hope that Isabella might signal a more modern Spain. It's muskets against muskets, but also manuscripts against manifestos. Ferdinand from the grave has birthed chaos, his legacy, a child queen barely able to speak, a regent mother walking a political tightrope, and a brother determined to plunge Spain into civil war. And if that weren't enough, he also leaves behind a court that feels like a circus missing its ringmaster. The palace under Maria Cristina tries to return to some semblance of order, but Ferdinand's peculiar designs linger. The secret passageways remain. The peepholes are still there. Servants whisper that some curtains still rustle at night, though no one dares check. Even his dressing gowns, dozens of them, hang untouched in a cedar-lined wardrobe like molting ghosts. More awkward still is the fate of the Royal Gallery, the hidden collection of moral art Ferdinand commissioned. Containing erotic reinterpretations of biblical tales, risky sketches, and morally ambiguous sculpture, the gallery becomes a point of delicate contention. Maria Cristina has it sealed, officially for preservation, unofficially because no one knows what to do with paintings of saints in silk stockings. Meanwhile, the royal confessor, Father Victoriano, finds himself increasingly isolated. Once Ferdinand's spiritual advisor, he is now treated with suspicion. Maria Cristina, aware of his influence on her late husband's more bizarre decrees, distances the church from the throne. She reassigns Victoriano to a distant monastery, but not before he's seen removing 2 large trunks from the palace archives. Their contents unknown. Speculation ranges from confidential letters to the infamous Book of Corrections. Either way, he disappears quietly, just as Ferdinand would have liked. Spain, however, does not disappear. It erupts. The Carlist uprisings begin with sudden violence. Entire villages choose sides overnight. Sons are conscripted, churches become fortresses, family members turn on each other. The war is brutal, intimate, and stained with fanaticism. Ferdinand's long reign had smothered dissent with censorship and fear, but with his death, all those buried tensions explode. Maria Cristina, surprisingly adept for a woman never trained in power, makes bold choices. She allies herself with the liberals, grants new constitutional freedoms, opens limited access to press and education, all in an effort to fortify her daughter's legitimacy and isolate Carlos. But it's a delicate game. Too much liberalism, and she risks alienating the conservative base that still venerates Ferdinand's memory. And Ferdinand's memory is everywhere. Streets named for him, statues in his likeness, a special chapel in Seville built to honour the most holy king of continuity. His face even appears on commemorative bread coins distributed by royal bakeries. And yet, behind these tributes, there's a sense of national confusion. Who was this man, really? To some, he was a pious king, a defender of the faith who revived the Inquisition and stood firm against revolution. To others, he was a tyrant, a perverse manipulator who played dress-up while Spain starved. The contradictions grow as more palace secrets surface. One example, a chambermaid named Inez publishes a memoir just months after his death. It's banned within days, but not before causing a scandal. In it, she describes being summoned to Ferdinand's room at all hours to read children's fables, while he sat in full regalia, wearing only slippers and demanding she mimic animal sounds. Another account, this time from a former guard, claims Ferdinand once held a mock trial for a melon he insisted had insulted his dignity by bruising before a state banquet. The melon was found guilty and ceremonially fed to pigs, who, in Ferdinand's words, knew better how to honour royal gifts. Historians today still argue whether these anecdotes are exaggerated or completely true. Some believe they were invented to discredit him posthumously. Others argue the opposite, that they barely scratched the surface. Because here's the strangest part. Despite everything, there are still those who miss him. Especially among the ageing nobility, there's a nostalgic whisper. At least with Ferdinand, we knew the rules. They may have been bizarre, capricious, and often humiliating, but they were Ferdinand's rules, and you could survive them if you played the game. With Maria Cristina, the game has changed, and Don Carlos wants to burn the board entirely. Throughout 1834 and 1835, the Carlist forces wage a guerrilla-style war, pushing into key provinces and threatening the monarchy's grip on the interior. Maria Cristina responds by forging stronger ties with Britain and France. Advisors come and go like revolving doors. She expands the national militia, arms the middle class, and quietly funds propaganda projects labelling Don Carlos as the king of the gallows. But even as the war rages on, the royal court clings to tradition. Lavish banquets are still held, courtiers still gossip, and Ferdinand's peculiar legacy is honoured in private ways, such as the annual Night of Reflection, where all mirrors in the palace are covered, in homage to the king's odd belief that reflections diluted the soul. One of the more surreal moments occurs in 1836 during a court masquerade. A nobleman appears dressed as Ferdinand himself. Velvet robes, artificial belly, powdered face. The crowd gasps. Some laugh nervously. Maria Cristina, seated on her regent's throne, forces a smile, but later has the man exiled. Impersonating the king may have been entertaining, but in a Spain still trembling from his touch, it is far too soon. By the end of the decade, the First Carlist War enters a grinding stalemate. Spain is weary, fields are scorched, coffers are drained, and Maria Cristina, increasingly unpopular among both liberals and conservatives, abdicates the regency in 1840. She leaves the country, taking Isabella with her for a time. Power shifts yet again, this time into the hands of liberal generals, but through it all, Ferdinand remains. in paintings, in church sermons, in the odd commemorative medallions given to schoolchildren. He haunts Spain not as a ghost, but as a question. How did one man so thoroughly distort the soul of a country? Even the architectural renovations he ordered, palace wings built at night to confuse guests, libraries arranged by scent rather than subject, continue to confound historians. A recent excavation of a forgotten storage chamber revealed dozens of mechanical birds wired with clockwork designed to chirp "Viva el Rey" when wound. It's unclear whether they ever worked, or whether Ferdinand actually cared. He didn't need his creations to function. He just needed them to exist. Because Ferdinand VII, for all his grotesque excesses and twisted rule, wasn't just a king. He was a curator of his own legend, a man who believed monarchy was theatre, punishment was poetry, and that Spain should not merely obey him, but become his reflection. And long after his death, that reflection lingers. There's something grotesquely poetic about the way Ferdinand VII marries. Each time, the occasion is cloaked in regal tradition, yet what unfolds behind closed doors has the flavour of a tawdry opera. 4 wives, 4 different strategies to cement his rule, reproduce his line, and serve his own peculiar appetites. But each union also pulls back the heavy brocade curtain on a monarch far more interested in dominance than companionship. His first marriage in 1802 to Princess Maria Antonia of Naples seems, at first glance, like a conventional dynastic alliance. She's royal, devout, and fluent in the elaborate etiquette expected of a Spanish queen, but their courtship, if it can be called that, is entirely performative. Ferdinand barely speaks to her in public, yet in private he dictates everything from her hairstyle to the lace trim on her gloves. He insists she never wear purple, a colour he claims betrays melancholy. Whether that's fashion advice or superstition is unclear. Maria Antonia quickly becomes ill, too quickly, some whisper. Her health spirals downward within 3 years. Tuberculosis, the court doctors say, but others suggest arsenic, or slow poisoning through creams and tinctures she was encouraged to use. At the very least, her decline is hastened by stress and isolation. She dies in 1806, just 4 years into their marriage, and Ferdinand, oddly enough, doesn't attend the funeral mass. Instead, he shuts himself in his study for 3 days, emerging with a new set of laws on royal mourning etiquette, none of which apply to himself. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816, comes after a long bachelor stretch filled with intrigue, mistresses, and a short-lived plan to marry an Austrian archduchess, who declined after reading Spanish newspapers. Maria Isabel is young, dutiful, and, unfortunately, naive to the realities of the Spanish court. She tries to please Ferdinand by embroidering his initials onto his nightshirts and organising musical evenings in the palace garden. He's unimpressed. Ferdinand's affections are unpredictable. One moment he showers her with jewellery, the next he bans her from using scented oils because he claims they disrupt his thoughts. When she becomes pregnant, he demands a list of every food she eats and insists on approving each meal himself. The birth is traumatic. The child is stillborn. Within months, Maria Isabel dies from complications. This time Ferdinand does attend the funeral, but only after ensuring the coffin is lined with fabric that complements the season. Grief for him is just another chance to dictate aesthetics. But it's his third marriage to Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony that most deeply illustrates the bizarre blend of repression, ritual, and perversion that defined Ferdinand's private world. The marriage is arranged in 1819. She's 16, pale, pious, and barely speaks Spanish. Ferdinand is 45, cunning, and obsessed with moulding her into his ideal queen. From the beginning, it's a catastrophe. She's terrified of him. He, in turn, is annoyed by her fear, but fascinated by the challenge. He reads her religious texts about obedience. He sends her notes written in elaborate rhyming couplets, half love poetry, half legal mandate. One particularly awkward example begins, "Though thou art meek and made of prayer, I ask thee now to loose thy hair." Their wedding night is a disaster of epic proportions. According to palace gossip, always abundant and often accurate, Maria Josefa locks herself in a closet and refuses to come out. Ferdinand, undeterred, slips love notes under the door and eventually falls asleep curled outside it. The next morning he insists everything went beautifully, though the look on her face suggests otherwise. Their marriage is never consummated, or if it is, it's done under such distress that it leaves scars. Maria Josefa retreats into near silence, attending Mass daily and communicating mostly with her personal confessor. She starts wearing gloves at all times, even in bed, and avoids eye contact with almost everyone. Ferdinand, frustrated and embarrassed, shifts his attention elsewhere, to new diversions, new favourites, and increasingly to ritualised humiliation as a coping mechanism. He begins hosting small, exclusive evenings in the palace under the pretence of discussing moral fortitude. Guests are seated in a circle, and each must describe the most embarrassing moment they've ever witnessed at court, real or invented. Laughter is required. Any silence is interpreted as dissent. One countess, caught giggling too softly, is ordered to read aloud from a theological text while standing on a stool in slippers shaped like pig heads. Some of these spectacles include audience participation. In one case, a nobleman who misspoke in front of a visiting ambassador is made to wear a dunce cap bearing the phrase "foreign affairs expert" for an entire week. In another, a servant accused of gossip is forced to recite palace news headlines in a rooster costume. But all of this, the mocking, the discomfort, the performances, are just outlets. Ferdinand's real focus always is power. Power over perception, power over emotion, and above all, power over the female body. Which brings us, with no small dread, to his fourth and final wife, Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily. She's young, strategic, and, unlike her predecessors, not afraid of him. Ferdinand chooses her for a reason. She's fertile, or at least that's the primary qualification he mentions to his advisors. Her letter suggests she knew exactly what she was stepping into, but hoped to survive it with dignity. Her early days as queen are marked by clinical regimentation. Ferdinand dictates her diet, almonds and pomegranate seeds for fertility, her wardrobe, loose cotton gowns with no corsets, and even her bathing schedule, to preserve internal warmth, he claims. He has her bedroom moved adjacent to his, connected by a hidden passage through which he walks barefoot at night. When she finally becomes pregnant, Ferdinand is ecstatic. Not loving, not tender, ecstatic. He drafts new laws before the child is even born, redefines the succession process, and has commemorative medallions struck that say, "From me, a kingdom." Notably, they do not mention her. The birth of Isabella in 1830 is a moment of triumph. The baby is healthy, squealing, and female, a fact that would provoke political crisis were it not for Ferdinand's recent legal manoeuvring. The pragmatic sanction ensures her succession, but also fractures the country. Don Carlos and his followers declare it invalid. The war is all but declared. But within the palace, Ferdinand becomes obsessed with his daughter. He insists on choosing her wet nurse. He demands daily reports on her naps, digestion, and temperament. He personally inspects her linens for signs of strength. Some doctors are instructed to rub her feet with rose oil as a sign of royal vitality. Isabella, of course, is too young to know any of this, but she's already a symbol of legacy, of controversy, and of her father's desperate desire to control time itself. Even as he ages rapidly, gout twisting his joints, teeth rotting from his gums, Ferdinand still believes he can shape her destiny. He designs a crib made entirely of glass and silver. He orders lullabies rewritten to emphasize royal duty. And once, when she catches a cold, he accuses the maid of betraying the bloodline. Eventually, Maria Cristina begins making quiet moves. She consults with liberal thinkers. She reaches out to foreign allies. She establishes a small advisory group designed to support her regency when Ferdinand inevitably passes, and he knows it. In his final year, Ferdinand becomes increasingly paranoid, suspicious even of his wife. He has her chambers searched for hidden documents. He demands her letters be read aloud to him. She complies, gracefully, even cheerfully, but begins preparing for life without him. By the time Ferdinand breathes his last in 1833, she is ready. 4 marriages, 4 women caught in the gravitational pull of a man who viewed union not as love, or even partnership, but as a mirror, designed only to reflect back his own image. And yet, in the end, it is Maria Cristina who steps forward, who gathers the pieces, lifts her daughter onto the throne, and begins the long, bloody effort to hold a broken Spain together. Ferdinand may have married 4 times, but Spain was his one true bride, and he left her bruised, beautiful, and on the verge of collapse. As Ferdinand's fourth and final wife wrestles with the explosive consequences of his legacy, the palace itself shifts from courtly pageantry to something more sombre, more exhausted, less a seat of power and more a scene of aftermath. But while Spain reels from the political fallout, the lingering atmosphere inside the royal chambers is something far less discussed and far more unsettling. The quiet institutionalisation of Ferdinand's tastes. Because the court he built did not die with him. It lingered. In tapestries that had to be removed due to hidden messages stitched into their edges. In side tables carved with riddles he alone could solve. In ministers still quoting his bizarre axioms like, "Mercy is best served with marzipan." Even the household staff are caught in a kind of grief-stricken confusion. Many had built their entire professional lives around anticipating Ferdinand's whims, a change in the colour of slippers, or whether incense should be burned clockwise or counterclockwise. One valet, unsure what to do with himself in the absence of orders, continues polishing Ferdinand's ceremonial sceptre every morning for a year. Another is found ironing a nightshirt long after the king has been buried. And those he elevated through personal indulgence, the so-called court of misconduct, as it was whispered behind fans and folding screens, they're scrambling. With Ferdinand gone, their lavish stipends dry up. The woman whose only job was to choreograph the king's ceremonial yawns at long banquets is sent back to the countryside. The man who earned a title for inventing 5 flattering synonyms for fat now finds himself mocked by commoners, because under Ferdinand's reign, sin wasn't hidden, it was curated, and nowhere was that curation more precise than the transformation of the royal court into a performance of excess. He structured everything, the punishments, the ceremonies, even the domestic rhythms, around a strange and meticulous code of royal misbehaviour. It wasn't enough for Ferdinand to rule. He had to do so through distortion, and he rewarded anyone who embraced that distortion with land, titles, and influence. Take, for example, the Order of the Crimson Fig, a secret honour created during his second reign. Reserved for courtiers who could entertain the king with stories of creative transgression, the order came with a velvet badge embroidered with a ripe fig, Ferdinand's personal symbol for temptation and indulgence. Members were known to meet at odd hours, dressed in masquerade costumes to retell court scandals in the style of epic poetry. There's even a documented case of a nobleman reciting an erotic adaptation of the Odyssey at one of these meetings, swapping out monsters for mistresses and gods for disgruntled cooks. Ferdinand applauded so long that the performance had to be repeated the next evening. It's this court, this culture, that Maria Cristina now inherits. And with it comes the question, how do you govern a kingdom where the ruling elite were trained to misbehave? She begins with purges, not violent, but thorough. The moral engineers, as some mockingly call them, are dismissed. Records of secret ceremonies are quietly destroyed. The velvet badges of the Crimson Fig are collected and burned. She re-establishes formal dress codes. Mass is no longer optional for courtiers. The whisper network that once thrived behind palace curtains begins to dissolve. And yet, despite her efforts, the rot lingers. Because Ferdinand's influence wasn't merely institutional, it was psychological. For over 2 decades, he had turned morality into theatre. Nobles learned to confess with flair, to sin with strategy. Punishment was a form of pageantry, and grace came through grovelling. These habits don't vanish overnight. Many continue to tiptoe through their daily duties, uncertain which rules remain and which have changed. One guard, unsure whether Ferdinand's old rule about not walking on tiles with odd-numbered patterns still applies, spends weeks zigzagging across the palace floor. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the real legacy of Ferdinand's misgovernance takes shape. A fractured Spain. Don Carlos gains traction. Carlist uprisings bloom in the north like weeds in the cracks of a crumbling patio, and Maria Cristina, already burdened with keeping the monarchy intact, finds herself overseeing a country not only divided politically, but morally confused. For too long, public virtue had been suppressed while private vice was elevated. Now, the population doesn't know what to believe in, except that whatever's coming next can't possibly be as strange as what just ended. And yet, even Ferdinand's punishments, those bizarre, ceremonial, humiliating little games, take on a mythic quality in the public imagination. They're retold in taverns, lampooned in puppet shows. One particularly popular street performance features a fictional version of Ferdinand wandering around Madrid, forcing people to confess their dreams, and then assigning them chores based on symbolic interpretations. Dreamed of a duck? You shall sweep ponds. Imagined yourself flying? Then mend the curtains. Feasted with demons? You'll wash my boots. The people laugh, but uneasily, because the humour is too close to history. One particular ritual from Ferdinand's reign gains notoriety after his death. La Hora de la Verdad, the hour of truth. Once a month, select courtiers would be summoned at midnight for an anonymous confession and correction session. Behind a curtain, Ferdinand would listen as each participant described what they believed to be their greatest personal flaw. He would then assign a symbolic punishment, usually theatrical, occasionally disturbing. One marquis who confessed vanity was made to wear a mask of his own face. A duchess who admitted pride was ordered to serve as a maid for 3 days, though only in a room no one entered. It was meant to be ironic, or poetic, or punitive. No one was quite sure. Historians still debate the purpose of these rituals. Were they spiritual exercises, performance art, a psychological experiment orchestrated by a lonely king trying to feel omniscient? One fringe theory suggests Ferdinand was documenting each confession to build a map of moral pressure points across the Spanish aristocracy, using that data to inform his political decisions. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. A court constantly policing its own conscience, not for goodness, but for strategic self-preservation. And now, without him, that court is adrift. Maria Cristina recognises this. She begins recruiting new advisors, young, ambitious, and less scarred by Ferdinand's games. She reopens select universities, eases restrictions on publishing, encourages scientific inquiry. But the transition is slow and uneven. Every new law she signs comes with a footnote. This is not how Ferdinand did it. Still, she persists, and slowly the palace breathes again. The hallways brighten, the mirrors are uncovered, the incense no longer clogs the air with overripe symbolism, and the whisper network, while still alive, loses its bite. But Ferdinand is never far. His name still echoes in the courts where his decrees are repealed. His portraits still stare from walls, eyes painted just slightly too wide, as if witnessing the future unfold without him. And his legacy, more than the wars, more than the rituals, is this strange, suffocating culture of moral contradiction. Because Ferdinand VII ruled through indulgence and fear, performance and punishment, piety and perversion. And for those who lived under him, the lines between right and wrong were always blurred. What mattered wasn't virtue, it was visibility, what you could get away with, what you could make look holy. And for a while, he made it all look like monarchy. Even among the many monarchs who wore lace collars and wielded absolute power like a gilded cudgel, Ferdinand VII manages to stand out, not just for his brutality or paranoia, but for the sheer peculiarity of his private life. His court didn't merely reflect his policies, it reflected his fetishes, dressed up in brocade and scented wax masquerading as royal protocol. And nowhere is this more evident than in the peculiar world of Ferdinand's fashions and fetishes. The king's daily wardrobe rituals bordered on the obsessive. Each morning a team of valets, hand-picked for their silence and steady hands, laid out a selection of garments dictated by a secret rotating schedule, known only to Ferdinand and one trembling footman named Jacinto. The schedule contained specific instructions tied to moon phases, feast days, and the king's own arbitrary whims. One Tuesday might call for saffron velvet with a thistle brooch, the next black damask lined with rabbit fur and a powdered wig stiffened with lavender starch, and the shoes. Oh, the shoes. Ferdinand owned over 700 pairs, many of them custom crafted to evoke authority while deceiving the foot. Some were embroidered with quotes, "Silence is sovereignty," "Step on sin," while others featured hidden compartments filled with herbs, coins, or tiny religious relics. At least 3 pairs were designed to squeak at irregular intervals, a tactic Ferdinand used, he claimed, to unsettle the dishonest. He frequently changed outfits throughout the day, sometimes up to 8 times, each switch accompanied by a short musical interlude performed by a court violinist. If the piece was too fast, the king would dismiss the player. Too slow, and the whole ensemble was replaced. One musician famously lasted only 12 hours before being exiled for excessive melancholy. Beneath these layers of pomp was something more intimate and bizarre: Ferdinand's fascination with tactile sensation. He reportedly kept swatches of fabric in a silk box beside his bed, which he would run his fingers across while making state decisions. Velvet soothed him. Linen annoyed him. A particular shade of crimson wool, he claimed, helped him envision justice. This sensory obsession spilled into the lives of those around him. Servants were assigned uniforms not based on rank, but texture. The softest silks were reserved for those serving tea. Coarse wool was for letter carriers. Any garment that rustled too loudly could be banned. One maid reportedly lost her position after her petticoat caused a draught to whistle through a corridor at precisely the wrong moment during a royal meditation. But even more curious were his so-called costume lessons, strange evenings when nobles were summoned not for diplomacy or dance, but for curated lectures on the meaning of attire. Ferdinand would appear dressed as a historical figure, Augustus Caesar, Charlemagne, or occasionally St. Lawrence, and deliver rambling monologues on the moral implications of fabric, sleeve length, or the spiritual resonance of a well-placed button. Attendance was mandatory. Anyone who arrived out of dress code was humiliated in theatrical fashion. One ambassador's wife, wearing an ivory gown that too closely resembled mourning attire, was asked to read aloud from a funeral manual while standing in a vase. Another guest, whose sash was tied incorrectly, was gently but publicly corrected by being wrapped in ribbons by 3 masked courtiers, while a harpsichord played in reverse. Historians continue to debate whether these rituals were sincere attempts at spiritual instruction or elaborate performances designed to keep the court in a perpetual state of self-conscious tension. Either way, they worked. By the late 1820s, many courtiers changed clothes multiple times each day just to hedge their bets against Ferdinand's unpredictable aesthetic verdicts. And then came the fetishes. The palace, already a labyrinth of secret corridors and surveillance peepholes, also housed a number of private chambers whose purposes were known only to a few. One such room, later discovered behind a concealed bookcase, was lined entirely with mirrors. Every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floor, reflected infinitely in all directions. Servants called it La Cámara de los Ojos, the Chamber of Eyes. Inside, Ferdinand was said to walk barefoot in silence, sometimes for hours. No one knows what he did there. But when the room was uncovered after his death, the mirrors were found covered in fingerprints and lipstick. Another chamber was stocked with mannequins dressed in garments Ferdinand had confiscated from disgraced courtiers or exiled ambassadors. He would arrange them into tableaux, assign them names, and on certain evenings speak to them as if conducting a royal court. When a valet once asked about the purpose of this room, Ferdinand replied, "They're the only ones who never interrupt." Perhaps the most infamous of his indulgences, though rarely confirmed by official records, was his interest in reversal ceremonies, lustiyam. During these events, servants became nobles, and nobles became servants, for one evening only. Ferdinand watched closely to see who embraced their role and who resisted. Those who played along received gifts. Those who questioned the ritual were quietly punished. One such reversal dinner saw the king's barber seated at the head of the table, awkwardly carving roast goose while a duke poured wine into his cup. At the end of the meal, the noble servants bowed and thanked the humble aristocrats for their service. The next morning, a list was posted naming who would be promoted and who would be reassigned. No explanations were given. The message was clear. Obedience was measured not by tradition, but by performance. And then there were the whispers about the royal seamstress. A woman named Carmela, brought in from Zaragoza for her embroidery skills, soon became the subject of hushed speculation. She worked only at night, her garments bore unusual symbols, and Ferdinand, it was said, requested fittings in private, not for himself, but for mannequins modelled after various members of his court. He would dress them in her creations, then instruct her to adjust the hem as if the wearer had something to hide. Carmela eventually disappeared. Some say she married and left the city. Others claim she fled after discovering one of her gowns had been used in a mock trial, staged by the king himself, complete with a jury of mannequins and a verdict rendered by fortune cookies, an imported novelty Ferdinand had recently discovered and renamed Whispers from Heaven. Ferdinand's fetishes weren't always sexual. Often they were ritualistic. Perverse, yes, but steeped in an almost religious seriousness. His desire to control the look, feel and flow of his environment was less about gratification and more about dominion. If the court was a body, he wanted to be the skin, the outermost layer felt by all, penetrated by none. As his health declined in the 1830s, these obsessions intensified. He became increasingly sensitive to temperature, insisting on rooms being precisely 18.5 degrees Celsius. He demanded certain colours be banned from the palace after claiming they caused philosophical unrest. Yellow, in particular, was treasonous. Orange was lazy. Only shades of red and indigo were deemed loyal. He even issued an informal edict requiring anyone entering his presence to dab a bit of rosemary water behind their ears. It focuses the scent of thought, he declared, while no one asked follow-up questions. In the end, Ferdinand's reign became not just a monarchy, but an immersive art installation of one man's compulsions. He governed not through edict, but through ambience. The feel of the rugs, the pitch of the violins, the way sunlight struck the drapes at exactly 2:15 p.m. And when he died, he didn't just leave behind laws, wars and debts. He left a kingdom still unravelling the meaning of colour-coded slippers. To understand Ferdinand VII's rule is to step beyond policy, past the flamboyant silks and scandal-laced banquets, and into a realm where even bodily indulgence becomes a performance of power. As gluttony, digestion, and bodily decay entered the monarch's everyday vocabulary, his lifestyle evolved into something almost mythical, equal parts absurd and alarming. And nowhere did this peculiar brand of royal eccentricity surface more vividly than in his diet. Ferdinand didn't just eat, he consumed as if dining were both duty and theatre. Meals were not simply sustenance but stages for performance. Breakfast could take 3 hours and involve as many as 6 courses, including one that always featured a sweet bread moulded in the shape of his royal seal. The bread was sometimes dyed blue with crushed violets, depending on his mood, or replaced entirely with marzipan replicas of famous Spanish fortresses. Lunch, held sharply at 3 p.m, was more extravagant. Soup made from swan bones, pickled partridge with gold leaf garnish, an entire piglet roasted and served with an apple in its mouth, carved not by the cook, but by the king himself. The table was a parade of visual puns, fish arranged to resemble military formations, sausages twisted into the shape of a bishop's hat, and grapes stabbed with tiny swords. Dinner, meanwhile, often devolved into chaos. Late, heavy, and served with wine by the pitcher, it regularly ended with Ferdinand falling asleep mid-chew or launching into impromptu sermons about the virtue of spices. One account describes him hosting an entire dinner in silence, communicating only through exaggerated facial expressions, while musicians played slow, minor-key waltzes in the background. No explanation was given. But Ferdinand's fascination with food wasn't just about excess. It was about control and curiosity. He kept a personal food taster named Esteban, who was not only required to sample every dish, but also describe its moral resonance. Esteban was trained to identify not only flavour, but whether a particular seasoning felt too ambitious or treasonously sour. He once refused to serve a saffron tart because he claimed it smelled of revolution. And yet, for all his culinary pageantry, Ferdinand suffered from chronic digestive issues, gout, constipation, sudden bloating. His doctors prescribed a kaleidoscope of remedies, boiled roots, vinegar compresses, and endless tinctures of questionable origin. Nothing helped. This led to one of the strangest chapters in the Royal Medical Archive, Ferdinand's obsession with laxatives. By the late 1820s, he had developed an almost devotional relationship with his digestive cycle. He reportedly timed his governmental meetings around his bowel movements, scheduled only after his internal balances had aligned. He kept a journal, hand-bound in green calfskin, dedicated to tracking these episodes with unsettling precision. Excerpts include entries like April 9th, 8 almonds, 1 plum, no movement, pray harder. May 3rd, roast quail, felt pride, some progress. June 12th, fennel, figs, explosion, victory. His royal physicians created a rotating formula of laxative teas, many of which contained ingredients so potent they bordered on alchemical. One recipe included powdered rhubarb root, dried beetle husk, and a hint of crushed pearls. For purity, Ferdinand insisted. He took these concoctions with ritualistic flair, seated on a throne-shaped chair in a private chamber decorated with tapestries depicting Roman emperors in moments of quiet contemplation. Some mornings, he invited priests to sit nearby and read psalms while he awaited relief. According to at least one priest's diary, Ferdinand once declared, "Clean bowels, clean conscience." But even his more human vulnerabilities became part of his theatrical rule. During one particularly bloated evening, Ferdinand demanded the court join him in reciting a poem he'd written in tribute to ginger root. It was called Ode to the Spicy Saviour. The poem was long, rhymed poorly, and ended with him throwing candied ginger pieces into the audience like confetti. To further manage his digestion, he became fascinated by colonic massages, then a novelty in European medicine. He hired a specialist from Naples whose official title was Therapist to the Lower Winds. This man, Signore Lorenzo, would appear during twilight hours, draped in white linen, and gently press on the royal abdomen while the king moaned about metaphysics. Rumours spread quickly. One pamphlet, printed anonymously in Barcelona, described Ferdinand as the flatulent pharaoh, and included cartoons of the king floating into the air on invisible cushions of gas. Though the pamphlet was banned, it circulated in taverns for years, its illustrations scrawled onto napkins, outhouse walls, and the backs of religious tracts. Ferdinand responded by creating the Sanctum of Scent, a small chamber lined with aromatic woods, where he would retreat during episodes of indigestion. No one else was allowed inside. Entry was granted only to a select dog, a toy spaniel named Rocio, trained to bark in response to certain herbs. If Rocio sneezed, the mixture was deemed too volatile. If she snored, it was perfect. To offset the embarrassment of his bloating, Ferdinand doubled down on extravagant feasting. He hosted digestive balls, where guests wore tunics shaped like fruits and danced in slow circular formations meant to mimic the intestines. Court musicians composed a waltz titled The Gentle Tumble, meant to guide the stomach into calm rhythm. One nobleman, unsure if the entire affair was satire, asked if he should bring a peach. He was immediately reassigned to Andalusia. Of course, these excesses didn't stay behind palace walls. The court's obsession with digestion became the subject of popular satire across Spain. Markets began selling candied figs labelled royal releases. Restaurants featured king's relief platters. Even pharmacists began offering approved by the crown stickers for their stomach powders, though many of these were fake, and none actually worked. Still, Ferdinand leaned into the absurdity. He joked publicly about his regal rhythms, even once commissioning a mural for his private bath that featured mythical beasts in the shape of intestines, twining around a golden throne. In the centre was a portrait of Ferdinand himself, smiling, seated with a sunburst behind his head and a celery stalk in one hand. Was this irony, self-parody, or the ultimate expression of egocentric dominion? Historians still argue. Some suggest his obsession with the digestive system mirrored his view of governance. What enters must be carefully selected, what exits must be judged. A steady internal rhythm equaled peace. Disruption meant rebellion. The court was a body, the king its gut, and Spain, always Spain, was the meal. And like his court rituals, these bodily indulgences became a kind of power language. To dine with Ferdinand was to pass a test. Could you handle the flavours, the timing, the unspoken cues about when to laugh, when to chew, when to groan appreciatively? Even physicians played their part. Reports from his final years describe moments when doctors would taste his food in front of him, announce their intestinal predictions, and then record them in a ledger bound in cork. All the while, Ferdinand's health declined. The very indulgences that defined his royal persona began to unravel him. His weight ballooned, his breath grew shallow, his skin took on a waxy sheen, but he refused to change, refused moderation, refused the notion that a king could be ruled by his own body. And so, he continued, stuffed, spiced, sweating, slumped in a gilded chair, whispering instructions to a footman about the proper length of a cinnamon stick. He was, in the end, a man devoured by his own appetite for performance, control, and sensation. A monarch whose bowels became political, whose menus became manifestos. A king who ruled through his stomach and made an empire burp. For most monarchs, religion is a framework, a divine justification for authority, a ritualized connection between the throne and heaven. But for Ferdinand VII, religion is something else entirely. It is a playground, a theatre, a stage on which sacred rites are bent, stretched, and at times cheerfully desecrated in service of his royal whims. Nowhere is his penchant for mixing the sacred with the scandalous more evident than in the strange pageantry of priests, pranks, and private masses that defined his personal brand of piety. To the public, Ferdinand is a devout Catholic. He funds monasteries, supports religious orders, and restores the Spanish Inquisition with eerie enthusiasm. He kneels often, crosses himself with performative grandeur, and insists on weekly processions featuring relics, choirs, and sometimes a borrowed donkey. But within the thick walls of his palace, behind bolted chapel doors, the holy becomes the hilariously unholy. He creates his own private clergy, a hand-picked circle of compliant priests who operate more like actors in a strange liturgical drama than spiritual advisors. Some are chosen for their sonorous voices, others for their impressive eyebrows. One is hired solely because his ears resemble the angelic curls in a favourite painting. These men are given custom robes dyed in colours not found in any liturgical calendar: maroon, navy, and on one occasion a fabric Ferdinand described as the colour of forgiven mischief. He holds private masses that defy canon, midnight services lit by scented lanterns, morning devotions delivered entirely in rhyme. On one infamous day he demands the Eucharist be presented to him atop a floating platter, suspended by wires from the ceiling. The mechanism fails, and the chalice crashes to the marble floor, spilling wine across the altar. Ferdinand claps. Even Christ descends with flair, he says. And then there are the exorcisms. Ferdinand, ever fond of theatricality, becomes fascinated by demonic possession. Not because he believes in it, necessarily, but because he enjoys the drama. He arranges mock exorcisms for select guests, complete with screaming actors, flailing limbs, and impromptu Latin recitations. One scene is so convincing that a duchess faints and must be revived with a silver spoon of brandy. These performances always end the same way. Ferdinand stands, hand raised, commanding the spirit to depart. "Leave this body," he shouts, "and bother only those who oppose royal decree." His courtiers erupt in applause. The possessed collapses. The candles are snuffed. Everyone is ushered out past a line of altar boys humming a slow, ominous dirge. His interest in confession is equally theatrical. He insists on hearing them, not giving, but listening. He installs a faux confessional booth in his study and invites nobles to unburden themselves for their own good. They step in, whisper sins through the screen, and receive personalised penance that ranges from composing poems about humility to wearing mismatched shoes for a fortnight. Naturally, these confessions are recorded, not by priests, but by court scribes who transcribe the sessions in journals marked Whispers for the Crown, Sustia. Locked in a gilded chest, these journals are kept in a hidden archive Ferdinand nicknames the Library of Frailty. Rumours suggest he reads them aloud during private meals, laughing softly while buttering toast. He also blurs the line between sermon and satire. On feast days he gives addresses to the court dressed as a bishop, robe, mitre, staff, all commissioned by his personal tailor. These sermons meander through themes of obedience, divine hierarchy, and the merits of silence. One particularly uncomfortable homily compares royal edicts to manna from heaven, except with more practical value and better taste. When the Archbishop of Toledo objects to these antics, Ferdinand invites him to a staged debate in the palace chapel. But instead of argument, the Archbishop is greeted by a puppet show reenacting the Council of Trent, with marionettes bearing his likeness. The performance ends with a puppet Ferdinand crushing a dissenting theologian under a scroll labelled Absolute Monarchy. The Archbishop leaves without comment. He's reassigned to a rural parish within the week. Even his prayer life is riddled with rituals that border on obsession. He prays in threes, 3 times a day, 3 minutes each, 3 genuflections per session. He faces specific cardinal directions depending on his mood. During Lent he fasts publicly, but secretly consumes rosewater pastries shaped like relics. His favourite is a biscuit moulded like St. Sebastian, which he bites starting at the arrow wounds. His private chapel reflects his spiritual contradictions. Marble saints line the walls, but each bears subtle alterations. St. Peter holds a sceptre instead of keys. St. Cecilia's lyre strings form the initials FV. St. Michael's foot rests not on Satan, but on a parchment scroll labelled Liberalism. Above the altar, instead of a crucifix, hangs a mirror, so that, as Ferdinand explains, the sinner may behold the Redeemer in himself. Visitors to this chapel are rare and tightly vetted, but on one occasion, a visiting French ambassador is permitted entry. He reports afterward that the floor was covered in rose petals, the incense smelled faintly of cinnamon, and the choir boys wore masks shaped like doves. He also claims that midway through the Mass, Ferdinand stood, clapped twice, and a hidden door opened to reveal a miniature fountain gurgling with red wine. Whether this was liturgical symbolism or simple indulgence remains uncertain. Perhaps strangest of all is his annual Sabbath reflection, a ritual he invents himself. Every December, Ferdinand retires alone for 3 days into a secluded chamber, known only to his closest attendants. He fasts, prays, and emerges wearing a crown of woven laurel leaves, announcing one single holy truth to guide the coming year. Some past proclamations include, "Let silence be as common as shoes," "Eat with dignity, for the Lord sees crumbs," "The devil hides in mismatched buttons," "Too much sunlight weakens the mind." These proclamations are written in gold ink and posted at every church entrance throughout the capital. Priests are instructed to incorporate them into homilies. Monks are asked to chant them during morning prayers. The general population, understandably, views them with a mixture of reverence and confusion. Still, Ferdinand never wavers in his fusion of sacred and absurd. To him, religion is not static. It's malleable, personal, performative. Faith is a tool, a veil, a means of turning power into prophecy and obedience into ritual. And when challenged on this unorthodox approach, he simply smiles and says, "If God did not love theatre, why did he make man a stage?" For all its eccentricity, Ferdinand's spiritual life casts a long shadow. His reinvention of Catholicism, not doctrinally, but in practice, plants seeds of confusion that persist long after his death. Clergy become divided. Some cling to the rituals he introduced, while others denounce them as heretical. Pilgrims visit the places where his bizarre ceremonies unfolded, unsure whether they are sacred or scandalous. And behind every candlelit corridor and whispered psalm, the memory of Ferdinand lingers, not as a devout believer, but as a sovereign showman, forever preaching from a pulpit shaped like a mirror. Most kings sit on thrones. Ferdinand VII increasingly prefers to lurk in shadows. By the late 1820s, as his body weakens and the court stiffens under the weight of his eccentric traditions, the king retreats further into his nighttime rituals, transforming the royal palace into a nocturnal labyrinth, where gas lamps flicker long past midnight and secrets rustle behind brocade curtains. It is in these hours that Ferdinand earns a new name among his closest attendants, El Rey Vigilante, the Watchman King. Insomnia has dogged him for years, but now it becomes a governing principle. While ministers sleep and courtiers dream of titles, Ferdinand walks. He walks with a cane carved from ebony, its handle shaped like a coiled snake. He walks in velvet slippers with soles so soft they make no sound. And always, always, he walks alone, except for 1 or 2 guards stationed discreetly down the corridor, instructed to avoid eye contact and respond only in whispers. He patrols the palace with the obsessive cadence of a night watchman inspecting his post. Sometimes he checks doors, jiggling handles to test for faults. Other times he stops at statues, gazing into marble eyes as though expecting them to blink. At least once he's found speaking softly to a bust of St. Augustine, asking whether truth is heavier in the dark. But his favourite activity is eavesdropping. Hidden nooks throughout the palace, designed or modified under Ferdinand's exact specifications, allow him to listen to conversations undetected. There's the hollow panel behind the tapestry in the Hall of Seals, the notch carved into the cornice above the library doors, a tiny spiralled vent near the choir balcony that carries whispers like a string instrument in reverse. He knows where to stand, where to breathe, when to lean forward, ministers discussing foreign policy, lovers murmuring by candlelight, servants gossiping over bread crusts. He listens to it all, and more importantly, he remembers. Days, even weeks later, he'll reference something someone said in passing, an offhand remark or idle complaint, letting the target know, subtly and unmistakably, that the king hears everything. These nocturnal exploits are not only about control, they're also about identity. In the shadows, stripped of the weighty robes and scripted deference, Ferdinand feels most like himself, free to observe, judge and understand without the filter of ceremony. In many ways, his rule becomes increasingly defined not by what he declares, but by what he knows before anyone else does. Still, there's something haunting about the image of the king in the hallway, stooped, wheezing, pressing his ear against a wall as candlelight dances across his face. One footman, startled by Ferdinand's sudden appearance at 3 a.m, later claims the king whispered only, "The floorboards know everything." Sleep becomes irrelevant. Daylight grows annoying. He shutters windows in his private quarters and drapes them with thick blue velvet. Meals are served at odd hours. One dinner takes place at 4 a.m, accompanied by a solo violinist playing only in minor keys. The dessert is a custard shaped like a crescent moon. Ferdinand eats it slowly, eyes fixed on the flickering flame of a single beeswax candle. This preference for night affects everything. The schedule of state business shifts. Ministers are forced to adapt to evening councils. The royal household adopts a reverse rhythm, supper before sunset, meetings after midnight. At first, they complain, but over time, the palace slips into sync with its sovereign's sleeplessness. It's not just the time of day that changes, it's the atmosphere. The palace grows quieter, eerier, echoes stretch farther, shadows fall longer. The candlelit portraits of former monarchs seem to gaze more intently, and Ferdinand, gliding silently through the gloom, becomes a fixture of dread and awe. He develops new rituals. At midnight he drinks a concoction of warm goat's milk, cardamom, and shredded mint leaves, allegedly to soften the inner spirit. He reads aloud from a rotating set of texts. Tacitus, Revelations, and occasionally pages from his own decrees. He listens to the ticking of an oversized mechanical clock that chimes not with bells, but with a slow, breathy sigh, a modification he personally requested. His favourite routine, however, is what his attendants call the hour of judgment. During this time, between 1 and 2 in the morning, Ferdinand sits in a high-backed chair facing a wall of mirrors. Before him lies a velvet-covered table with 5 glass marbles, a wax seal, and a tray of folded notes. Each note contains a name, a minister, a noble, a clerk. He selects one, unfolds it, rolls the marbles across the table, and declares a decision aloud. Promote. Punish. Observe. Relocate. Reward. No one else is present. The results are recorded the next morning by a trusted scribe who's never allowed to ask questions. Whether these decisions are symbolic, strategic, or entirely whimsical is unclear. But by week's end, something always shifts. An official reassigned, a tax collector dismissed, a sudden arrest in Cadiz. Then there are the dream records. Ferdinand, fascinated by the subconscious, begins asking his staff to report their dreams. Not in person, but by written note. Anonymous, sealed, and submitted before dawn. He reads them over breakfast, eating fried eggs while mulling the symbolism of flying dogs or lost teeth. Occasionally he responds in kind. A steward who dreams of falling is assigned a promotion. A maid who dreams of drowning is gifted a silver pendant. One guard who dreams of stabbing a king is reassigned to the royal stables in the Canary Islands. Quietly, permanently. Psychological control becomes his favourite weapon. Even his silences are calibrated. Ministers begin checking their speech for unintended implications. A sigh during court is seen as dangerous. A mistimed smile, even worse. One diplomat reportedly feigns a cough every 30 seconds during an audience to avoid being asked questions. Ferdinand is pleased. He crafts a new title for himself in his private journals, El Oído Dorado, the Golden Ear. He imagines himself as the invisible conscience of Spain, listening when no one watches, judging without speaking. In these notes he writes, "A king must be as unseen as guilt, as present as breath. It's poetic, it's also deeply unsettling." By the final years of his reign, Ferdinand's nighttime reign has overtaken his daytime persona. During official ceremonies, he seems sluggish, distracted. But in the dark, he is alert, pacing, plotting, prying. Rumours begin to circulate that he's using night walks to commune with ghosts. One maid swears she saw him conversing with a shadow. Another insists she heard him sing lullabies to the portraits in the Hall of Ancestry. Historians disagree. Some argue it was the morphine used to treat his chronic pain. Others suggest undiagnosed dementia. But those who studied his letters, always lucid, always layered with subtext, suspect the opposite. Ferdinand wasn't unravelling. He was refining, burning off the need for daylight, for audience, for applause. He no longer needed to be seen. He only needed to see. And so the Watchman King walked, through galleries, stairwells, attics, and kitchens, past relics of grandeur and the faint smell of wax, past noble busts and whispering rugs, past the line between ruler and phantom, until finally he vanished not into death, but into memory, one shaped like flickering candlelight and the hush of breath behind a wall. If there is a single word to describe the way Ferdinand VII wielded punishment, it would be personal, not legal, not necessarily proportionate, but personal, crafted with theatrical flair, emotional precision, and more often than not a twist of dark humour. As Spain staggered under his iron grip, Ferdinand transformed cruelty into ceremony and discipline into deeply disturbing art. Punishment under his reign wasn't always swift, it was curated. It wasn't about justice, it was about expression, a means for Ferdinand to assert dominance not just through law, but through symbolism, and those unfortunate enough to cross him often found themselves caught in performances they didn't audition for. Take, for instance, the case of Don Alejo, a court translator who made the mistake of altering a minor clause in a trade agreement with Portugal. Rather than have him arrested or exiled, Ferdinand summoned Alejo to a grand banquet and seated him at the child's table. Literally. The setting was miniature, the cutlery toy-sized, the chair so low he could barely reach his plate. The humiliation was compounded by the fact that all other guests were instructed to treat him as if he were 12. They toasted to his bright future and offered him sweets. He wept silently through dessert. That, for Ferdinand, was a successful punishment. It sent a message. It didn't require blood. And it left everyone involved more loyal through fear than any gallows could inspire. But he didn't always spare the body. Public floggings made a brief return under his watch, though always dressed in theatrical justification. One clergyman, accused of circulating anti-monarchist sermons, was sentenced to 30 strokes of spiritual correction, in a ceremony held at dawn where each lash was followed by the reading of a psalm. Ferdinand attended in full regalia, nodding solemnly with each crack of the whip. Then there were the mock trials. Dozens of these took place throughout the 1820s, staged within palace walls. The accused were often courtiers who had violated some obscure rule, incorrect seating at dinner, wearing a banned colour, or failing to laugh at a royal anecdote. These trials were conducted by actors dressed as judges, complete with powdered wigs and scrolls that unrolled to the floor. Witnesses were chosen at random. Ferdinand would preside silently, masked, perched on a raised platform draped in crimson. Sentences were never fatal, but they were always humiliating. A woman found guilty of moral stiffness was ordered to host a tea party dressed as caricature of herself. Wig inflated, mannerisms exaggerated, every sentence spoken in rhyme. Another nobleman who had commented on the king's increasing girth was sentenced to wear a corset and recite poetry about moderation in the palace garden for a week. Even the landscape bore the mark of his punitive creativity. He ordered the construction of a maze in the royal grounds, not for pleasure, but as a disciplinary zone. Disobedient staff were sent into it and told they could not leave until they found a silver bell hidden within. Guards were instructed to confuse them with misleading directions. Some emerged after hours, trembling and changed. A few refused to speak of what happened inside. Rumours suggested hidden figures, whispered voices, or even actors planted to frighten them further. Whether real or imagined, the maze became legendary. But not all of Ferdinand's punishments were imposed on others. He reserved some of his most elaborate for himself. During periods of perceived failure, poor harvests, court gossip, signs from dreams, he engaged in rituals of penance that blended piety with performative masochism. He walked barefoot through candlelit hallways, chanting the names of saints. He sat in a salt-covered chair to scour the sins of comfort. He once refused food for an entire day and instead consumed only wine-soaked bread in the shape of thorns. These acts, though private, were not entirely secret. He ensured that tales of his humility spread just far enough to reinforce his mystique. The people, meanwhile, responded with equal parts awe and dread. To many he became a figure too strange to hate outright. You didn't resist Ferdinand. You avoided his attention, like a solar eclipse best viewed indirectly. Still, some punishments had political purpose. When Catalan merchants protested new tariffs, Ferdinand responded not with violence, but by banning Catalan pastries from the royal table. In Seville, when a bishop questioned his interpretation of divine authority, the king declared a week of scriptural silence, during which no religious text could be quoted aloud in that region. Even holidays weren't safe. One year, a popular feast day coincided with the anniversary of a minor insult he once received from a French diplomat. He cancelled the festival, replacing it with a nationwide moment of reflective gravity. Children were forbidden to sing. Bread was baked without crust. Fireworks were replaced by single-candle vigils. This blending of vengeance with pageantry was Ferdinand's hallmark, and he never shied from spectacle when fear could serve as theatre. He once organised a punishment parade through Madrid. Those convicted of civil disobedience, not criminal acts, but things like refusing to pay a new toll, were dressed in costumes that mocked their crimes. A man who had argued against a road tax was dressed as a donkey with a map pinned to his side. A widow who defied a royal dress code wore a tunic embroidered with the phrase "Fashion before Fatherland." They marched while crowds jeered and Ferdinand watched from a balcony sipping spiced wine. Theatrics aside, there was something deeply strategic about these rituals. They reinforced the idea that transgression wasn't just a threat to the crown, it was a personal offence to Ferdinand himself. And personal offences required personalised responses. He even crafted a series of tokens, small, hand-painted tiles with symbols like snakes, broken chalices and storm clouds. These were given anonymously to individuals who had displeased him. No explanation, no verdict, just a token. The recipients would often panic, trying to decipher the message. Some offered bribes to court officials, others fled the capital entirely. The fear of punishment often proved more powerful than the act itself, and that, ultimately, was Ferdinand's goal. To rule not just by force, but by psychology. By creating a system where discipline wasn't merely punitive, it was interpretive, mysterious, and deeply entangled with identity. He didn't need gallows or dungeons. He had masks, mirrors, and the ability to turn even a glance into a sentence. It's no surprise then that, even after his death, stories of his punishments persisted like ghost tales. A nobleman in Valencia refused to enter a mirrored room for the rest of his life. A clerk in Toledo burned every purple garment he owned. A former chamberlain reportedly woke each morning and recited aloud, "My name is mine, but my fate is his." These were not the legacies of torture chambers or public executions. These were the scars left by a man who turned monarchy into performance art and punishment into a kind of eerie folklore. Because Ferdinand VII didn't just punish his enemies, he choreographed their downfall. By the dawn of the 1830s, the Spanish court had grown used to Ferdinand VII's eccentricities, his velvet shoes, his whispered decrees, his punishments spun into poetry. But beneath the increasingly bizarre rituals and late-night surveillance, one concern weighed heavier than all others: the future of the monarchy. Ferdinand, aging and decaying like a forgotten mural in a damp cathedral, had produced no male heir, and in the rigid patriarchal structure of early 19th century Spain, a daughter simply wasn't supposed to rule. That daughter, of course, was Isabella. Born to Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, Ferdinand's fourth wife and niece, Isabella was his golden hope, his final grasp at immortality. From the moment of her first breath in 1830, Ferdinand began remaking the monarchy around her, bending ancient laws and provoking deep-seated hatreds to ensure her right to rule. His desperation to preserve his bloodline would upend Spain, fracture families, and fuel civil war. To understand the scale of Ferdinand's determination, one must revisit the Salic Law, a Frankish relic adopted by the Bourbon dynasty that barred women from inheriting the throne. It had stood for generations. But when faced with a future in which his brother Don Carlos would succeed him, Ferdinand made a seismic decision. He issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, abolishing the Salic Law and naming Isabella his heir. To liberal Spaniards, this was a progressive act. To conservatives and absolutists, it was heresy. And to Don Carlos, it was nothing short of betrayal. Carlos had spent decades believing he would inherit the crown. He was every inch the reactionary, a staunch Catholic, a defender of autocracy, and a man whose idea of compromise involved bayonets. Ferdinand's decree threw him into open opposition. He began quietly amassing support from clergy, landowners, and rural nobles who still longed for the unbending old order. Meanwhile, Ferdinand, increasingly ill and grotesquely swollen from gout and endless feasting, set about showcasing his daughter as the future. He demanded portraits, hundreds of them, depicting little Isabella as a miniature queen, her infant hand clutching a sceptre, her soft face framed by regal curls. These images were distributed like holy cards. Citizens were expected to hang them in homes, shop windows, even stables. One tailor was arrested after refusing to pin one to his apron. He choreographed public appearances in which Isabella was paraded like a relic, lifted in gold-trimmed cradles, kissed by bishops, waved at by murmuring crowds. At one event, Ferdinand had her presented to a group of nobles, while choirs sang a newly composed hymn titled "The Cradle of Continuity." She blinked and drooled through the whole thing. But there was another side to the pageantry. Ferdinand's increasing obsession with controlling Isabella's every breath. He demanded daily reports from her wet nurse. Her diapers were weighed, her heartbeats counted, her babbles interpreted by astrologers for signs of divine favour. One unfortunate midwife, who noted that the infant's eyes seemed to gaze toward the floor, was dismissed immediately, accused of disloyal thoughts. Her toys were specially commissioned to reflect royal duty. Miniature scrolls, silver crowns, dolls dressed as saints. Her first shoes were made from silk imported from Lyon, dyed the exact blue of the Bourbon coat of arms. Even her lullabies were rewritten to include references to governance, divine right, and national unity. Ferdinand began designing her future court. He drafted a list of potential tutors, none selected based on their qualifications but on their handwriting, which he believed revealed moral character. He outlined a schooling regimen that included ceremonial posture, sacred silence, and a daily hour of sovereign stillness, during which Isabella was to sit, unmoving while incense burned. This fixation wasn't purely paternal, it was political. Isabella had to be perfect, not merely to succeed him, but to vanquish his enemies posthumously, and his greatest enemy, increasingly, was his own brother. Don Carlos, furious and emboldened, began to gather loyalists across northern Spain. The press, such as it was, broke into two camps: those who hailed Isabella as the dove of destiny, and those who proclaimed Carlos the lion of tradition. The country began to whisper of coming war. Armed groups formed in Navarre, Aragon and Catalonia. The courts began issuing new titles, not to reward loyalty, but to secure territory. Ferdinand, too sick to ride but too proud to admit it, created what became known as the Royal Parade of Endurance. Every 2 weeks he was wheeled through Madrid in an open carriage, Isabella seated beside him like a porcelain doll. He waved weakly. Sometimes he slurred his words, but the message was clear. This is your queen. Obey her. And not all were convinced. Within the palace itself, whispers grew louder. Some questioned Isabella's legitimacy, not her parentage, but her very right to rule. Conservative nobles plotted with clergy. Secret meetings were held in candlelit monasteries. More than once, Maria Cristina found coded messages sewn into the hems of court gowns. To reinforce Isabella's claim, Ferdinand turned once more to theatre. He held a naming ceremony not in the chapel, but on a raised dais in the palace gardens, where Isabella, barely a toddler, was presented to Spain in a ceremony that included poetry, choreographed birds, and a massive tapestry that unfurled to reveal the Bourbon family tree, with Isabella's name embroidered at the top in gold thread. The old branches that led to Don Carlos had been subtly pruned from the design. But Ferdinand's body was failing. By 1832 he suffered daily from leg ulcers, kidney pain, and episodes of near coma. His face, once cherubic, was waxy and grey. He wore a neck brace beneath his collars to keep his head upright. He dictated letters through clenched teeth, and had to be spoon-fed soft cakes by attendants who sang hymns to mask his wheezing. In a particularly grim moment, Ferdinand reportedly tried to sign a new decree, but lost control of his hand, scrawling only a spiral. When shown the signature the next day, he declared it symbolically appropriate, like a crown seen from above. Still, he clung to power. At the height of his decline, Ferdinand ordered that all official correspondence begin with the phrase, "By my breath it is so." Even as he drifted in and out of consciousness, Maria Cristina and his most loyal ministers continued to push for public affirmations of Isabella's succession. And then, in a final cruel twist, Ferdinand briefly recovered. For one brilliant, terrible week in early 1833, he rallied, speaking with clarity, standing, with assistance, even dictating a few letters. His enemies panicked. Don Carlos's supporters began burning documents and retreating into hiding. The court whispered of a miracle, but it didn't last. One morning in September, Ferdinand coughed blood into a silver handkerchief, stared at the ceiling and murmured, "I see her, the small queen." He died within the hour, and with his death, the delicate mask of peace fell away. Spain would soon erupt into the First Carlist War, a brutal, grinding conflict that would pit father's dream against uncle's fury. The war wasn't just about politics. It was about inheritance, about blood, about a bloated king's fevered will carried out through the baby he crowned in his final breath. And Isabella. She slept through the announcement. Wrapped in silks, she rested in a crib beside the bed where her father had died, unaware that she had become a symbol, a pawn, and a spark for years of bloodshed. The death of Ferdinand VII didn't end the performance. It simply changed the script. Spain, long trained to read between the lines of royal gestures, now stood blinking beneath a sky that seemed suddenly too quiet. There were no more royal parades at midnight. No servants gliding across mirrored halls with marzipan moulded into the shape of angels. No orders penned with gold ink about velvet shoelaces or the moral importance of spice. But in the vacuum left by Ferdinand's final breath, something even more volatile began to swell: civil war. The country split nearly in two. On one side stood Queen Regent Maria Cristina and her infant daughter Isabella II, the chosen heir of Ferdinand's desperate dynastic reshaping. On the other side stood Don Carlos, Ferdinand's younger brother, thundering forth from the northern mountains with his legions of Carlists, who saw the pragmatic sanction as heresy and a female monarch as a catastrophe. The stage was set not for a coronation, but for bloodshed. And yet Ferdinand's ghost remained very much alive in every corner of the conflict. His portrait still watched from court walls. His writings were cited both by liberals, who painted him as the last bulwark against Don Carlos's fanaticism, and by conservatives, who saw him as a misunderstood martyr who'd wanted strong male succession. His policies, his laws, his taste in punishments and processions, all of it became ammunition in a war where bullets were fired as often as sermons. But nowhere was Ferdinand's posthumous presence felt more than in the decaying shell of his own body, because true to form, even in death, Ferdinand insisted on drama. Before burial, his corpse was displayed in a chamber draped entirely in black velvet. Incense choked the air. A choir whispered psalms written by the king himself, each line awkwardly rhymed, each refrain repeating the phrase, "O sovereign dust." But the moment that left the strongest impression came during the public viewing. His face had bloated terribly in the days after death. His hands, once adorned with rings, were bare. His skin had taken on the pale yellow of tallow, and his teeth, famously crooked in life, had blackened so swiftly that the viewing was cut short. One foreign observer, a Prussian envoy, wrote in his journal, "The king has passed into wax. He resembles a melted candle of divine right." The embalming process had failed. His body began to rot. Quickly. Doctors blamed the exotic ointments used in life, balms filled with oils, crushed pearls, and extracts of nightshade. Others blamed the intense heat of late summer. Whatever the reason, Ferdinand's remains had to be sealed in a lead-lined casket far earlier than planned. Still, the ceremony continued. His funeral procession was slow, winding through Madrid's narrow streets in a theatrical display of grief. Children wept on cue. Nobles dressed in grey. Soldiers marched in silence, their boots coated in black ash so as not to clatter against the cobblestones. The final eulogy, delivered by Archbishop Juan de Llano, described Ferdinand as a king of paradoxes, blessed by the Lord with imagination and cursed by men with misunderstanding. It was, in a way, accurate. The burial was sealed beneath El Escorial, the grand monastery palace that housed generations of Spain's monarchs. Ferdinand's casket was placed in the pantheon of kings, among the bones of ancestors far more dignified and far less complicated. His tombstone was simple, bearing only his name, dates, and the phrase "siempre vigilante," always watchful. The irony did not go unnoticed. Yet the king's body wasn't the only thing that decayed rapidly. The political order he left behind collapsed with astonishing speed. Isabella II, not even 3 years old, was declared queen under her mother's regency. The nation, however, remained unconvinced. The Carlists, now openly armed and evangelizing, declared Don Carlos the rightful king, launching the First Carlist War in a matter of weeks. Spain became a battleground not just of armies, but of ideologies. Liberals and moderates clung to the idea of a constitutional monarchy, with Isabella as a modernising force. Absolutists and traditionalists clung to the past, waving swords in the name of Don Carlos, Catholic orthodoxy, and what they insisted Ferdinand had truly wanted. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand genuinely believed in Isabella's right to rule, or whether he had simply feared his brother's rise more than legal convention. There are letters, after all, where he waffles, drafts full of crossed-out phrases like "the divine plan of male succession" and "exceptions must serve eternity." And while the armies clashed in Navarre and the Basque country, while villages were burned and bishops gave conflicting sermons, Ferdinand lived on in strange and often ludicrous ways. Carlist troops painted his face on their banners, smiling, crowned, gazing eastward. In liberal pamphlets, caricatures of him appeared weeping into a cradle or arguing with ghosts in a library. Children sang street songs about King Fat Fernand, who was said to have eaten a whole roast ox and still had room for treason. His former court, too, found itself in freefall. Many of his closest advisers fled or faded. Father Victoriano, his confessor and spiritual choreographer, vanished entirely. Some say he joined a monastery in Salamanca. Others claim he died en route to South America, muttering about the sin of mirrored ceilings. The royal tailors, who once stitched scandal into every sleeve, now mended army uniforms. The musicians who composed lullabies about statecraft began playing funeral marches. The puppeteers who performed theological debates in the palace chapel, gone. Their puppets, found years later in a dusty attic, were burned in a ritual fire that one general claimed was necessary for national healing. And what of Maria Cristina? She held the regency with grit, compromise and constant fear. She faced assassination attempts, slander and betrayal from within her own court. But she protected Isabella. She maintained the crown. And she steered the country through the brutal, confusing opening years of the Carlist conflict. Through it all, she never spoke ill of Ferdinand. Even as his enemies grew louder, even as his statues were quietly removed from city centres, she kept his portrait above her writing desk. A version of him younger, cleaner, painted before the punishments and the powdered wigs began to droop. In private letters she called him Mi Caos Dorado, my golden chaos. Isabella, as she aged, was taught to both revere and carefully forget him. She was told he had been great and good and very wise, and when she asked about the donkey bishop or the singing mirrors, she was hushed, because Ferdinand VII had become myth. Not legend, not legacy, but myth. Twisted, bloated, and slowly rotting like the marzipan saints he so loved to order by the dozen. Yet myths don't disappear. In taverns the old stories persisted, of midnight judgments, of punishment mazes, of a king who listened to dreams and ruled by the sound of whispers. In rural chapels, old women still crossed themselves backward on his birthday, just in case. And in the palace kitchens, long after the silver was polished and the chairs dusted, some swore they heard slippered footsteps echoing at night. Even dead, Ferdinand kept walking. Long after his bloated corpse was sealed away in a lead-lined tomb, Ferdinand VII remained, alive in memory, festering in rumour, reborn in myth. He was no longer just a king, nor even a tyrant. He had become something stranger, a lingering stain on the velvet of Spain's national identity, a ghost with greasy fingers that refused to be wiped clean, and nowhere was his presence felt more than in the confusion he left behind. The Spain of the 1840s, plunged into civil war, ideologically fractured, limping toward modernization, was still operating under the shadow of Ferdinand's reign. His policies, erratic as they had been, laid the groundwork for two opposing futures, one bent toward conservative, absolutist tradition, the other reaching awkwardly for liberal reform. Each claimed his legacy, each feared it. Don Carlos, now deep in the mountains of the Basque region, continued to invoke his brother's name. In rallying speeches he painted Ferdinand as a king deceived by sycophants, manipulated by foreign ideas, and desperate in his final years to reverse his error of naming a daughter as heir. These speeches were delivered to men sharpening bayonets, women blessing scapulars, and children who'd never known peace. Meanwhile, Queen Regent Maria Cristina and her liberal allies pushed a different narrative. Ferdinand as a cautious reformer who, in his last noble act, safeguarded Spain's future through his daughter. Pamphlets circulated showing Ferdinand with his hand over baby Isabella's cradle, shielding her from wolves with black mitres and tricorn hats. The imagery was heavy-handed but effective, and amid the ideological fog, people began crafting their own version of the late king. In Seville, tailors told stories of Ferdinand's secret love for Moorish fabrics, claiming he once wore a turban to bed for philosophical warmth. In Zaragoza, an entire café was decorated with caricatures of Ferdinand's rumoured disguises: bishop, nun, jester, chimney sweep. Patrons were served their tea in cups shaped like miniature thrones. In Madrid, a travelling puppet troupe put on nightly performances of Ferdinand's trials, a farce where nobles confess absurd sins, and the king levitates above them wearing mirrored shoes. Children laughed. Adults stared in silence. Even the church, despite years of uneasy allegiance, began to quietly roll back the stranger aspects of Ferdinand's religious legacy. Gone were the choreographed sermons, the puppet debates, the exorcisms by appointment. But they kept some of the incense formulas, out of habit, or perhaps because no one could remember the original recipes. The palace itself changed, though it bore his fingerprints in every corridor. The mirrored room behind the library was sealed. The costume gallery was dismantled. The punishment maze in the royal gardens was torn up and replaced with a reflecting pool. But the servants still whispered when the lights flickered at night. The new guards, young and uninitiated, spoke nervously of a portrait in the West Wing that sometimes blinked. As for Isabella, she grew into a monarch burdened by contradiction. Crowned queen at age 3, she inherited not just a war, but the echo of a reign that defied logic. Her education was carefully managed. She learned statecraft from moderates, prayer from conservatives, and diplomacy from foreign advisers who all disagreed on how to speak of her father. In her diary, kept from age 10 onward, she refers to Ferdinand sparingly. Once, in a shaky hand, she writes, "They say he was clever. They say he loved me. They say he punished people for yawning. Still, she carried his blood, his name, his throne. When she began holding court as a teenager, some nobles bowed not to her but to the memory of her father. They recalled his obsession with control and sought to mirror it through protocol. They enforced silence during royal meals. They arranged seating charts by astrological sign. They installed a new mirror of loyalty in the council chamber, an object no one looked into but everyone feared. The Carlist War dragged on. Lives were lost, cities burned, treaties were signed, broken, signed again. Spain changed, but not quickly. And through it all, Ferdinand's presence clung like old incense, diluted, but never quite gone. Even abroad, Ferdinand became a point of fascination. French newspapers ran retrospectives on the mad majesty of Madrid. British travellers wrote memoirs comparing his court to Bedlam, cloaked in satin. An Italian playwright produced a satire called Il Re Silenzioso, depicting Ferdinand as a mute who communicates through perfume. It won awards. In time, historians began to try sorting the truth from the legend. They combed through letters, court transcripts, private journals. They uncovered the wardrobe ledgers with their odd colour codes. They unearthed the confession journals, the whispers for the crown, stored in wax-sealed boxes, written in a delicate hand with obsessive precision. Some scholars argued Ferdinand was misunderstood, a melancholic genius whose quirks became pathology only under pressure. Others insisted he was fully mad, propped up by opportunists and dangerous only because of the power he wielded unchecked. But one detail united nearly all historical accounts. The man loved symbols. He believed in metaphors more than laws, in gestures more than decrees, in the idea that governance was not about justice, but about choreography. Even his will, discovered only after his burial, reads like a script. He left instructions for his heart to be removed and placed in a crystal jar beside Isabella's crib. It wasn't followed. He asked for a candle to be kept burning in his private chapel until Spain finds its centre. It lasted 2 weeks before a pigeon knocked it over. He requested that his journals be read aloud every year on the anniversary of his coronation. They were locked away instead. And in the margins of that final testament he had written a single phrase: A king must outlive his century, even if only in rumour. It's hard to argue he failed. Ferdinand VII left no legacy of glory, no great buildings, no military triumphs, no golden age. What he left was something far more unsettling: a haunted institution, a political identity crisis, and a court trained in the art of pretending not to understand the rules until it was too late. He ruled with a wig and a whisper. He punished with poems and parades. He buried Spain beneath a velvet curtain, and even after it was lifted, the dust remained. And so Spain limped forward, divided and dimly lit, its throne occupied but never quite filled. Isabella ruled. Carlos rebelled. The people hoped. The past echoed. And somewhere in the minds of those who remembered, the old servants, the scattered priests, the trembling nobles who once wore donkey ears for forgetting to bow, the night still held a shape. It moved like velvet. It smelled faintly of rosemary. And it whispered, always whispered, El rey no duerme. The king does not sleep. So now, with the candles dimmed and the court grown quiet, we can finally let Ferdinand VII rest, if he ever truly could. Spain has moved on, reshaped and ruptured many times since his reign, but his peculiar silhouette still lingers at the edge of its memory. A monarch not remembered for conquest, or law, or great speeches, but for shadows, silk, and the strange gravity of a man who treated monarchy like a stage, and every subject like a prop. In the soft hush of night, you might still imagine him, wandering through endless halls, whispering to portraits, listening through keyholes, searching not just for control, but for reassurance that he was still being watched, still being heard. History, for all its firm judgments and footnotes, never fully locks its doors. It leaves windows cracked, curtains rustling. It allows strange kings like Ferdinand to echo through time, not through achievements, but through the soft unease they leave behind. And maybe that's what he wanted all along. Not to be loved, not even to be obeyed, just remembered. Like a riddle no one solves, like a dream you can't quite shake. So sleep now, if you can. Let the halls go quiet, let the silk gowns dissolve into dust, and if you ever find yourself pacing at midnight, haunted by thoughts you can't explain, don't worry too much. You're not alone in the dark. Ferdinand walks too.